Fire Captain, engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Picture this. A television show so poorly rated that the network nearly pulled the plug twice. Produced on a budget so laughably small that the crew was literally recycling toy guns and borrowed Halloween costumes to build an entire galaxy. A show that, by every measurable standard of its era, was considered a commercial disappointment. And yet, somehow, that same show went on to inspire real military weapons programs, convinced NASA scientists to rethink space travel, and fundamentally reshape how human beings imagine their own future. We are talking about a program that aired for just 3 seasons, got canceled quietly in 1969, and then spent the next 6 decades refusing to die. Star Trek. The original series is one of the strangest success stories in the entire history of entertainment. And the story behind the story is even stranger than anything that ever happened on the bridge of the Enterprise. So buckle up, because we are about to go deep into 20 of the most bizarre, surprising, and genuinely jaw-dropping facts about the show that dared to believe humanity was worth saving. Let's begin with the man at the center of it all, or rather, the man who almost never got there. When Gene Roddenberry first developed Star Trek and brought it to NBC, the captain of the Enterprise was not James Tiberius Kirk. The role was built around a different actor entirely. Jeffrey Hunter, a legitimate Hollywood leading man best known at the time for playing Jesus Christ in the 1961 biblical epic King of Kings. Hunter filmed a complete pilot episode, playing a character called Captain Christopher Pike, a thoughtful, introspective, philosophically burdened commander who carried the weight of leadership like a man genuinely troubled by the moral costs of power. The pilot was finished, delivered to the network, and Hunter was fully prepared to continue. Then, for reasons that have been debated ever since, he walked away from the project before the second pilot was commissioned. The most widely circulated explanation involves his wife at the time, who reportedly felt that television was beneath an actor of his stature and encouraged him to focus on film work instead. Whatever the true reason, Hunter's departure created a vacancy that would ultimately be filled by William Shatner, and the entire personality of the show shifted as a result. Where Pike was brooding and restrained, Kirk was electric and instinctive. The soul of Star Trek, as the world came to know it, was, in a very real sense, an accident of casting. Jeffrey Hunter passed away in 1969, the same year the show was canceled, never living to see the cultural earthquake that followed. Now, while Captain Kirk's casting was an accident, the look of Mr. Spock was a deliberate design battle that almost went in a shockingly different direction. Gene Roddenberry's early notes on the character described Spock with reddish, almost infernal-looking skin, a visual choice that was meant to telegraph his alien nature immediately and make him appear genuinely unsettling to human eyes. The design team ran with this concept in early sketches, leaning into an almost demonic aesthetic. The problem was not creative. The problem was technological. In 1966, a significant portion of American households was still watching television on black and white sets. Red pigment, when photographed in black and white, renders as a deep, dark shade that in that era carried immediate and deeply uncomfortable racial connotations. The network flagged this immediately. The production team pivoted, settling instead on a greenish-yellow skin tone, subtle enough that it would read as alien without creating visual problems on monochrome screens. The irony, appreciated by virtually everyone involved after the fact, is that the tint was so delicate it was nearly invisible to color television viewers anyway. What actually sold Spock's alien nature to audiences was not the skin tone at all. It was the ears. 2 pointed prosthetic ears that Leonard Nimoy endured for years, and which became arguably the most recognizable physical feature in science fiction history. Speaking of things that became iconic through accident rather than intention, almost nothing in the entire Star Trek universe illustrates this principle more perfectly than the transporter. The ability to disassemble a human body at the molecular level and reassemble it somewhere else is one of the most philosophically audacious ideas in the history of science fiction. Scientists have written papers about it. Physicists have run experiments inspired by it. It has become cultural shorthand for instantaneous travel in virtually every language on Earth. And it exists because the production could not afford to show a spaceship landing. The original plan called for the Enterprise crew to travel to planetary surfaces via shuttlecraft, small auxiliary vehicles that would launch, descend, and land. This would have looked remarkable. It would also have required expensive model work, elaborate set construction, and complex special effects sequences that were simply beyond what the budget allowed. Someone on the production team, accounts differ on exactly who deserves the credit, proposed instead a visual effect where characters would dematerialize in a shower of sparkling light. The effect was achieved by filming glittering particles dropped against a dark background, and then reversing and layering the footage. The total cost was a fraction of any shuttle sequence. The transporter became not just a storytelling convenience, but one of the defining symbols of the entire franchise. And the idea has proven so durable that quantum physicists today still invoke it when discussing the theoretical possibilities and ethical complications of teleportation research. Before the show that the world eventually fell in love with could even begin, NBC had to reject an entire version of it first. The original pilot, a self-contained episode titled The Cage, was completed and delivered to the network in 1965. The response from NBC executives was, by all accounts, not gentle. The episode was deemed too slow, too intellectual, and too lacking in conventional action to work as a weekly adventure series. There's also a specific objection to the character of Number One, the ship's female first officer played by Majel Barrett, who would later become far better known as Nurse Chapel and eventually as the voice of the Enterprise computer across multiple series and films. Network executives in 1965 were reportedly uncomfortable with the premise of a woman in a senior command position, though Roddenberry himself disputed exactly how that objection was framed. What is documented and remarkable is what happened next. NBC, rather than simply passing on the show entirely, did something extraordinarily rare in television history and commissioned a second pilot. They wanted the show to work, they just needed it to be different. Roddenberry retooled substantially, brought in William Shatner, restructured the tone, and delivered a version of the show that the network was willing to air. As for the original rejected pilot, it was not wasted. Roddenberry later incorporated its footage into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which became the only episode of the original series to win a Hugo Award. The rejection became an award winner. One of the most powerful behind-the-scenes stories in Star Trek history involved an actress, a resignation letter, and an unexpected conversation at a civil rights event. Nichelle Nichols joined the original series as Lieutenant Uhura, a black woman in a position of authority and competence on the bridge of a starship, at a time when black performers on American television were overwhelmingly cast in subservient or background roles. The significance of that representation was real. But during the filming of the first season, Nichols was also receiving serious inquiries from the New York theater world, where she had roots and ambitions. She made the decision to leave the show and submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. The weekend before she was due to finalize that decision, she attended a fundraiser for the NAACP and was told that a fan of the show wanted to meet her. That fan turned out to be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King told her, in terms she later described as deeply moving, that Star Trek was the only show he and his wife allowed their children to stay up late to watch, because it was one of the only programs on television that portrayed a future in which people of all backgrounds stood together as equals. He told her that Uhura was not just a character but a symbol, and that her presence on that show was doing work that no protest or speech could replicate. Nichols withdrew her resignation the following Monday. The decision to stay arguably shaped the cultural legacy of the show more than almost any other single choice made during its production. Leonard Nimoy's relationship with the character of Spock is one of the most fascinating actor-role dynamics in television history, and it did not begin as the harmonious partnership it eventually became. When Nimoy first approached the role, his primary concern was practical and professional. He was worried the pointed ears and alien makeup would make him look monstrous rather than sympathetic, and that being visually associated with a creature-like character would permanently limit his career options. Beyond the cosmetic concerns, there was a deeper artistic challenge. Nimoy was a classically trained actor whose entire toolkit was built around emotional expression. the ability to convey inner life through subtle physical performance. Spock required him to do the opposite, to suppress visible emotion entirely, to perform the absence of feeling in a way that still communicated rich inner complexity to an audience. That is a significantly harder acting problem than it sounds. What ultimately resolved both the professional anxiety and the artistic challenge was audience response. Viewers did not see a monster in Spock. They saw something rarer and more interesting, a character whose emotional restraint felt like discipline rather than emptiness, whose logic felt like a coping mechanism rather than a limitation. Fans wrote to Nimoy in volumes that surprised him. Young people who felt like outsiders connected with Spock in ways that were intensely personal. Nimoy eventually wrote 2 autobiographies. The first, published in 1975, was titled I Am Not Spock, a declaration of separation from a character. The second, published in 1995, was titled I Am Spock, a complete reversal. The journey between those 2 titles is the whole story. On the 22nd of November, 1968, Star Trek aired an episode called Plato's Stepchildren, and in doing so broadcast what is widely recognized as one of the first interracial kisses in the history of American primetime television. The moment involved Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols, and the network's anxiety about it was so intense that it produced one of the more remarkable acts of creative defiance in television history. NBC's position was that the kiss should be framed as involuntary, the result of telekinetic control by alien antagonists, so that the network could deflect any backlash from affiliated stations in the South by arguing that neither character had chosen the contact. The writers complied with the framing, but Shatner and Nichols had a different approach to the filming. During takes in which they were directed to keep their faces apart and make the kiss clearly reluctant or absent, both actors reportedly made subtle errors, small hesitations, slight misdirections, that made the footage unusable. In the takes that were ultimately usable, the 2 turned toward each other. The network had its alien compulsion disclaimer. The actors had their moment. Nichols later described receiving an extraordinary piece of mail in the aftermath, a letter from a white man from the southern United States who wrote that the image had genuinely disturbed his previously held beliefs and set him on a path of reconsidering them. A single scene, on a science fiction program, in a Friday night time slot. The story of how Star Trek survived long enough to become a cultural institution involves one of the earliest and most organized fan campaigns in television history. After the first season, NBC began signaling that the show's ratings were insufficient to justify its cost. After the second season, those signals became something closer to a public intention to cancel. What the network did not anticipate was the organizational capacity of the show's audience. With no internet, no social media, no email, and no digital infrastructure of any kind, fans across the United States coordinated letter-writing campaigns of a scale that was simply unprecedented at that point in broadcasting history. Estimates from network archives and contemporary accounts suggest that well over 1 million individual pieces of mail arrived at NBC's offices across the 2 major campaigns. Fans organized petitions on university campuses. Groups gathered outside the network's physical headquarters in New York. The public pressure was sufficient to produce a result that had essentially no precedent. NBC not only renewed the show for a 3rd season, but made the announcement publicly at a fan convention, a gesture that acknowledged, perhaps for the first time in mainstream television history, that an audience's devotion to a program constituted a legitimate claim on that program's future. The 3rd season was troubled, budget cuts were severe, and the show was moved to a late Friday time slot that guaranteed poor ratings. Cancellation came in 1969. But those 3 seasons gave the show enough episodes to qualify for syndication, and syndication was where everything changed. The USS Enterprise is one of the most recognizable fictional vehicles ever designed, a spacecraft whose silhouette is immediately identifiable to people who have never watched a single episode of Star Trek. The original filming model, measuring approximately 11 feet in length, was a masterpiece of mid-60s model making and is now preserved in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. What the Smithsonian display does not prominently advertise is that the model was never completed on its underside. The craftsmen who built it were working under strict time and budget constraints, and they applied their most detailed and careful work to the surfaces that would actually appear on camera: the upper hull, the primary saucer section, the warp nacelles, the areas that would be visible in the carefully composed shots used throughout the series. The bottom of the model, which the camera operators never pointed their lenses toward because no shot in the show required it, was left in a significantly rougher state, unfinished in sections, unpainted in areas, lacking the fine detail work that covers every surface the audience ever saw. The reasoning was entirely practical. There was neither time nor money to finish surfaces that served no purpose. This means that one of the most celebrated artifacts in the Smithsonian's collection, a museum piece visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, has an underside that looks like a work in progress, a permanent reminder that even iconic things are built with limited resources and calculated priorities. Here is a fact that will ruin a small but meaningful piece of your cultural memory. The phrase "beam me up, Scotty" does not exist anywhere in the original Star Trek series. Not in any episode. Not in any form. The exact combination of those 4 words, in that order, as a complete sentence, was never spoken by William Shatner or anyone else during the show's 3-season run. What Kirk does say across various episodes includes phrases like "beam us up, Scotty," and "Scotty, beam me up," and simply "Enterprise, beam me up," variations that are close enough to the famous formulation that the cultural memory collapsed them all into a single clean, quotable line that never actually existed. This phenomenon, where a misquote becomes more famous than anything actually said, is more common than most people realize. Humphrey Bogart's character in Casablanca never says, "Play it again, Sam." Sherlock Holmes, in Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories, never once says "Elementary, my dear Watson." Darth Vader does not say, "Luke, I am your father." He says, "No, I am your father," with a crucial word of negation at the front that the cultural memory routinely drops. In the Star Trek case, the misquote is particularly significant because the actual show contains dozens of memorable lines, none of which achieved the same cultural penetration as a sentence that was never spoken. Language, it turns out, is not a recording. It is a living thing that edits the past to serve the needs of the present.